Donald Prothero. He is a senior paleontologist at ArchaeoPaleo Environmental Management. He's taught at Pierce and Vassar, Occidental College, Caltech. He's a geologist and paleontologist. He's the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 34 books and over 250 scientific papers, including 5 leading geology textbooks. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, a member of the Linnaean Society of London. He's also been featured on, you've seen Don a lot on these History Channel shows on dinosaurs and so forth, and he's also leading our geology tour on Sunday and a very special tour to the United Kingdom next summer, a geology tour for that, which he's also going to tell you a little bit about before he starts his talk. Please help me welcome Dr. Donald Prothero.
So, Michael asked me to lead this thing off. I come from a background as a geologist, as a paleontologist, and also as a published climate scientist, so I come in a background relevant to a lot of things. But in particular, I wanted, as Michael asked me to do, talk a lot about the scientific foundation for a lot of what we'll be talking about today. In other words, understanding of what's happening to the planet and what's happening to humans' future based on these things we'll talk about. And so I wanted to talk about that. If you're interested, and actually I have a book to plug too. It's out on the stands there. We just published a year and a half ago called Reality Check, and much of what I'll talk about is backed up and cited in there. So if you're interested in further reading or references, it's all in there for most of this. And in a 30-minute talk, it's really hard to do justice to any topics, but I will do a very quick run through just 3 main topics. I'm going to really focus on what's happening with mass extinction and what's happening to extinction of animals today. I'm going to focus on climate change, a topic of really great importance, but something that's not talked about as much as it should be. And the limits of non-renewable resources, something we don't hear in the media much because it isn't something that makes their attention, but something that's not a secret. Geologists have known about this for close to 70 years, and it's all happening according to the way geologists have predicted for a long time. Our first topic, mass extinctions. As a paleontologist for 30, 40 years now, we've known about 5 major mass extinctions in Earth history. The worst of which is this one right here at the end of the Permian, 250 million years ago, which killed off 95% of life in the oceans. The one you're most familiar with is this one, number 5 here, which killed off the dinosaurs. Okay? And now what you hear a lot of people talking about is the 6th extinction. Okay? The 6th extinction then refers to this idea that we as humans in the last several centuries have been wiping out animals and plants on this planet at a rate that was simply unmeasurable compared to anything that happened before. And in most of the recent estimates, my good friend Tony Bernowski at Berkeley published a couple of books on this, is that the rate of extinction that we're producing is maybe 1,000 times the rate of any mass extinction that was naturally caused before we came around. Certainly will be bigger than the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs, and probably bigger than even the biggest extinction of all. Something in the estimate of at least 100,000 to 140,000 species are lost every year, mostly small animals, but some big ones as well. And lots of estimates that something in the order of 50% of all species on this planet will be gone before the century is out. Okay? Largely because we as humans, of course, are terribly destructive to our environment in lots of ways, especially cutting down rainforests is the fastest way to kill species because most of them are in rainforests. And already at this point, half the world's tropical rainforests are gone in just a century and a half since we started cutting them down. So you can look at this in a lot of different ways. For example, right now, just at this moment, okay, 25% of all mammals on the planet are threatened, endangered, or just about extinct. 13% of all birds, 40% of all amphibians, and so on and so forth. You can see it goes across the board in almost every form of life. And at this point, for example, already gone 136 species of birds, 300 mollusks, 79 species of mammals, 68 fish, and so on. And this is largely due to humans destroying habitat, sometimes direct hunting, often introducing our pests that come with us, like rats and cattle and goats and things that humans bring with them. All of this contributes to this mass extinction. Okay? And of course, it's very clear what the cause is. We are the cause. It's very closely connected to our population growth. The rate of species extinction has pretty much matched what we as humans have done as we are the species that's crowded every other species of the planet off the surface. Now, the saddest part of this is that, a lot of this was unplanned, a lot of this was not controlled, but there's some things that just make no sense whatsoever. And the saddest part is many of the most beautiful and conspicuous animals on the planet are being killed off for reasons no more than the mythology of Asian folk medicine, right? The people in China and Vietnam believe that if you use rhino horn shavings, you will somehow gain your virility or fight off a fever, which is complete garbage. And yet, because China is becoming wealthy now, The price of rhino horn is more valuable than per pound than gold or cocaine, right? So the pressure for poaching is enormous. This is the last northern male white rhino in wild, okay? And he has a 24-hour guard because that's the only way you can keep him in the wild. Otherwise, as you see, they cut his horn to make sure he's less tempting, all right? And not just rhinos. Wildlife all over the planet is being slaughtered, mostly for the silliest things of all, like Chinese medicine. We have, for example, elephants, of course, being killed for their ivory. Rhinos, as I said, their horns being killed for medicine. Tigers are killed for their body parts, again, for Asian medicine. And then bear gallbladders are very popular in Asian medicine. And so all these animals are probably going to be extinct on this planet before my kids are old. There's not much chance we're going to save them. It's very tragic, okay? Especially in the case of elephants. And elephants are not only magnificent creatures, elephants are also really important to maintaining the ecosystem. Elephants are keystone species, they call it. They maintain the structure of the savanna in Africa by breaking down big trees and opening up habitat. And when they're gone, everything else that depends on that will disappear with them, okay? So why should we care, okay? We're humans. We don't care about other animals, right? Well, you can make a practical case that many important medicines have come from both animals and plants that are often just barely being understood by science, and then we wipe them out, we'll never have those. That's a practical reason. Or the argument I just made. Lots of ecosystems are dependent on key species like the elephant, and they will fall apart, deteriorate if the elements are no longer there to keep it that way. Or many people would argue animals have just as much rights as we do, right? And we have no right to completely destroy the planet just for our own good. Although we talk to people in the starving part of the underdeveloped world, you won't get much sympathy on that argument. I like this argument right here that Paul Ehrlich made a few years ago. He said, imagine you're in an airplane, and you look out the window, get a window seat, and you look out the window, and you see a rivet pop out of the wing. And you say, oh, it's just one rivet. Another rivet pops out of the wing. Another rivet pops out, okay? At what point do so many rivets pop out of that wing that it can't fly anymore and then you're going to crash? We don't know, okay? And you don't know as someone who's not an aviation engineer. But you don't want to see rivets popping out of the wing, right? And you don't want to see the life on the planet go extinct because we just don't know how crucial they may be to survival, not just every other animal, but to us as well. It's not good to be destroying our own airplane wings. All right, and that's all I have time for on that topic. It's one we can obviously say a lot more about. Now, climate change. Again, I'm going to race through a lot of stuff here because I only have 30 minutes. I'm not going to argue about its reality. That's a scientific reality in itself. Okay, just as John Oliver says, there's no point in arguing whether 2 + 2 is 4 or anything like that. 97% of climate scientists agree it happens as well consensus as gravity, as any other major idea in science. The only question we should be arguing about is what do we do about it? How bad is it going to be? What do we do about it? And that's what all my colleagues in climate science do, is that's what they're looking at the future based on what they can observe. And of course, there are people who will pick and choose data and cherry pick data, and they'll do crazy things like this, where they'll try to slant the data by picking little segments and fitting lines in dishonest ways. But that isn't science, okay? Here is the most recent, just from last year, temperature curve, and you hear people say, oh, it's been paused since 1998. Well, that's cherry picking the year 1998 is deliberate deception. That was an extraordinary El Nino year, and that's why it was so warm. And so it's only been topped by a few years since then. It turns out, of course, last year shattered the record of 98. And this year is already on record to look like it's going to be much worse, in which case no one will be talking about the pause since 98. Now, what we have to talk about then is what kind of scenarios we can visualize for the future in terms of what temperature is going to do. And there's various versions of it. Ideally, what we should be doing is reducing our carbon emissions immediately and pulling stuff out of the atmosphere and reducing it so that we can restore the planet to the way it was. But nobody really thinks that's realistically possible, even though that's what we should be doing. Most climate scientists and people in climate policy say if we can hold it to 2 degrees Celsius rise, we may have a chance of survival, okay? But in fact, almost all the models looking at what we have now say that it's going to rise to something in the order of 3 to 5, maybe 6 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And you say, oh, 6 degrees Celsius. No, that is worldwide global average. Even during the ice ages, it only changed a degree or 2 Celsius. Okay, that's how big this difference is. And so far, as of last year, we're on this trajectory right here, the bad scenario trajectory. Okay? Okay? The World Bank said in 2012, if temperature increases by 4 degrees, this is the same one I just talked about, extreme heat waves, declining global food stocks, loss of ecosystems, biodiversity, life-threatening sea level changes, effects of which will be tilted against many of the world's poorest regions, stalling or reversing decades of developmental work. That's where we're headed. It will take enormous effort to avoid that fate. Holding that temperature down to just 2 degrees Celsius, the target we would agree on, requires utterly unprecedented levels of global mobilization and coordination, sustained over decades. And there's no sign that we can see that kind of cooperation in the world yet. Okay, so you say, oh, well, it's going to get a little warmer, right? We'll just have nice warmer temperatures, not so much cold winters. Well, if you live in the south or western part of the U.S., expect heat waves, bad heat waves, okay, killer heat waves, which we've already had several of in the last decade. Just this week, plucked from the headlines, almost 2,000 people are dying in India right now from a record heat wave, 120-degree temps for better than 2 weeks now. Okay, this is going to happen all the time in the future. Okay, and there's lots of things that's going to happen to life as well. A lot of life will migrate or move to different places. I'll just point to one example that's not so good. You make this planet warmer, tropical mosquitoes can get to places they don't normally get to, like here. Okay, and malaria and dengue fever and someone will be introduced to places which have never experienced those before. Okay? Those of you who have been to the Rocky Mountains in recent years, you know how terrible it looks right now. The Rocky Mountains' entire forest region has been just about wiped out in many places, thanks to the invasion of the bark beetles that have come through. And the bark beetles are invading because we have not had the hard frosts in the winter that used to be routine that kept their populations in check, that killed their larvae during the winter. And so now the high percentage of the Rocky Mountain forest now are these giant tinderboxes just waiting to burn, which several have burned in recent decade. Here's another consequence, as you all heard about sea level rising, okay? You don't realize it, but sea level has already risen 8 inches since 1900, okay? That much has already happened, okay? And then various projections of where it's going to go in the future, something in between 1.6 or 4.5 feet, or in other words, 0.5 to about 1.4 meters, just by the end of this century. At least a meter, maybe 2 meters by the end of this century. You say, oh, well, a meter sea level rise, I'm not going to worry about it. Well, you should if you live in Louisiana, because the entire southern half of the state is barely a meter above sea level. And ironically, the governor of that state is a climate denier, okay? And then if you live in Bangladesh, one of the poorest and most heavily populated pieces in the world, a meter to a rise of sea level will wipe out all of Bangladesh, okay? In fact, the entire eastern seaboard is vulnerable, okay? Including Florida, which has another climate denier for governor who won't even let them talk about climate change, and North Carolina, which tried to have this King Canute type vote to say that climate change wasn't happening, as if that's going to change anything, okay? They're going to be the ones who get hurt first, and ironically, they're the ones with their heads in the sand. If it all melts, if we lose all the ice caps on the glaciers in the Antarctic, Arctic, and Greenland, okay, this is what will happen, okay? 215 feet rise in sea level in the United States. All the coastal states will be gone. You can take your deep sea ocean liner all the way to Carroll, Illinois, if you like. Okay? And it's ironic because this has happened in the geologic past when we had greenhouse climates and no polar ice caps. It happened in the Cretaceous, and these are Cretaceous rocks in Oklahoma. It happened back in the early part of the Paleozoic, and that's over here in eastern Oklahoma. It's been drowned many times, and it will get drowned again. And ironically, the biggest climate denier in our entire public sphere, this guy right here, is snowball thrower, of course, is the leading member of the Science Committee in the Senate right now, denying climate science and to the hilt, and his whole state's probably going to rue the day he was ever their senator. Here is the same thing for Europe, for those who came across the pond. You can say goodbye to much of coastal England, and most of England for that matter. All of the northern part of Europe is going to go underwater, major portions of the other parts of Europe as well, and this is worldwide. Now, we say, oh, well, we'll just move somewhere else. Well, what if you're the resident of Vanuatu or the Marshall Islands and your whole country goes under the waves? Where do you go? Okay, your country disappears, okay, and that's happening. Many of these island nations that we've only just hatched a few decades ago, they don't have much longer to live. Now, it's not going to all happen right away, right? We're talking a meter sea level rise maybe by the end of the century, maybe several meters. Either that way, most people aren't going to notice it in that form for quite a while. What they will notice, however, is the way in which large hurricanes come much further onshore because they start at a higher sea level. And then if you add that to, say, a higher tide, like happened with Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and Irene in 2011, they go way onshore where they've ever been before. So the coastal regions, even before the sea level fully rises, will be washed away by hurricane after hurricane, just as with coastal New Jersey was during Sandy, and of course New York City was hit as well. Okay, that's the first sign. When you start seeing cities being devastated by one giant storm surge after another during hurricanes, that's a sign sea level is rising. Now, mentioning hurricanes, of course, is another issue. We had record hurricanes in the Atlantic over the last decade or so. Remember the season of 25, which had 5 Category 4s or 5s, including Katrina, and Irene in 2011, Sandy in 2012. And now the last big ones have happened in the Pacific with the typhoon season. Haiyan in 2013 and Nuri just last summer. Okay? And these have been a catastrophic system. Just to give you a sense, Haiyan, which didn't make the news hardly at all in this country, unless you're Filipino, okay? Nobody paid much attention to it. It was the biggest storm ever recorded. 195-mile-an-hour winds, never measured before in any hurricane of typhoon of any size. This is the size of Haiyan from space compared to Katrina. It literally just plastered the southern Philippines. 7,000 people died. Okay? Here's our third harbinger of what's going to happen. Of course, the Arctic ice cap and all the ice caps are vanishing. They already have just about disappeared in much of the Arctic in the summertime. And they were there 3 to 4 million years ago when they formed. They have not seen that kind of thing since then. Okay? Here's what the models have predicted they should do. Here's what's already happened to them. They've deteriorated faster than any model was ever thought to do. So back in 2012, this was the situation. Here's the 30-year average of where this ice was in the summer. There's where it was in 2012. That much of the ice is gone. Okay? It's just falling off the shelf fast in terms of how fast it's deteriorating. So yes, there may be an upside in terms of drilling in the Arctic or taking northern sea routes, but it has lots of negative consequences as well. The North Pole, no place for Santa or Superman's castle anymore. Okay? In fact, my grad advisor, Malcolm McKenna, in 2000, flew over the North Pole and was one of the first humans to see it in open water. His picture of it was on the New York Times when he came back from that trip. And it has lots of sad consequences as well. We all heard about them. And it has surprising side effects that people never thought about until they started happening. Here, for example, is the way it was last winter, when everyone was complaining about how cold it was in the east and throwing snowballs on the floor of Congress, right? They don't know the difference between weather and climate, okay? And yet, look at the global pattern, right? The entire world, on average, was much warmer, especially down in Australia, where they had record heat and drought every single winter of ours with summer of theirs, okay? It turns out this is also related to polar ice cap. The climate science community has come pretty much to agreement that what's happening is that the poles warm. They no longer have a tight, very strong gradient between the colder poles and the warmer temperatures and temperate latitudes. It's weakening the jet stream that serves as a barrier between us. And when the jet stream weakens, then cold polar air can slide south and stay around for a while. And that's why we had a couple of record cold winters over the last couple of seasons, okay? In just those places, not anywhere else in the world. Same bad story for the Antarctic, especially the West Antarctic ice cap is melting at a phenomenal rate. The East Antarctic won't take much longer to develop. We saw in 2012 the Larsen B ice shelf disappear, the size of Rhode Island. This last month, Larsen C started to break up. It'll break up before the month is out, next month. And it is a size bigger than Scotland. It will disappear and break up into icebergs. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is when we're talking about warming, we're not just talking about that tiny little bit in the atmosphere. That's a very small percent. Most of the heat goes, 93% of it goes to the oceans. And for years, we thought, oh, the oceans are a giant heat buffer. They have huge heat capacity. They'll keep the planet from warming. Well, sorry, that's not going to happen. In fact, what's scarier than anything I just told you is that the oceans are showing that they're really warming up much faster than anyone thought they could. Right? We always thought they were really stable to temperature change, and it turns out they're not. The most obvious symptom of this is what's called the bleaching of the coral reefs. Most of my friends who are serious divers, 30 years ago, they dived on reefs all over the world, the Caribbean, the South Pacific, the Great Barrier Reef. They tell me all now that when they go back to those same reefs today, only 30 years later, they're all dead. It's alarming how fast the reefs of the world are dying. What's happening is that when the temperature warms past a certain threshold, the algae that live inside the coral polyps cannot live anymore. And when they die, when those algae disappear, the coral polyp dies and the coral reef dies. This is called coral bleaching. White corals are a bad thing. They're dead. Okay? Even scarier, this was just published a couple of years ago and now shown up several times. One of the basic items of the food chain in the entire polar regions are these little planktonic snails called pteropods, or nicknamed sea butterflies. Okay? These guys make their shells out of aragonite, the mineral that makes pearl, which is very soluble compared to calcite, like most animals in the ocean use for their shells. And what we're seeing happen is that as these larvae develop, their shells, which are starting out thin, never have a chance to get thickened because the ocean is too acid. Okay, it used to be a stable pH of 8.2. It's now decreasing rapidly and headed toward acidity. When these guys go out, it's like the canary in the coal mine. These are the most sensitive to ocean acidity of any organism on the planet. And if we lose the pteropods, not only is the ocean too acid for them, it'll soon be too acid for many things. And these guys are the base of the food chain in the Southern Ocean. So goodbye whales. Okay? If you talk to the oyster farmers and many of the other types of fisheries people in the world, there's a crash going on now in oyster farming because the larvae can't develop their shells because the ocean water is too acid. Okay? Now, this scenario is very familiar to my friends in paleontology. I count myself as a paleontologist first and foremost. The biggest mass extinction in Earth history I mentioned up at the beginning was 250 million years ago when it wiped out the entire coral reef system of the planet, trilobites and many other organisms you may or may not have heard of, along with these big finback reptile groups that are related to us. 70% of land animals, 95% of marine species died out. And a consensus opinion now, after much research over the last 40 years, is that it was all due to a huge burst of acid in the ocean, too much carbon dioxide. Sound familiar? Okay. And the reason for that case was natural. It was a giant volcanic eruption in Siberia, the biggest eruption in all history. So I'll say Brother Neil tell it for us here. We are dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a rate the Earth hasn't seen since the great climate catastrophes of the past. The ones that led to mass extinctions. We just can't seem to break our addiction to the kinds of fuel that will bring back the climate last seen by dinosaurs, the climate that drowned our coastal cities and wreaked havoc on the environment and ability to feed ourselves. All the while, the glorious sun pours immaculate free energy down on us, more than we'll ever need. Why can't we summon the ingenuity and courage of the generations that came before us? The dinosaurs never saw that asteroid coming. What's our excuse? Okay? Finally, let me bring this point up. This is one I said that doesn't have as much publicity as the other two. But it's a very serious one, and it will really impact what a lot of people are going to say today, because a lot of people think business as usual is going to occur for centuries, and it's not. There's lots of resources on this planet. They're non-renewable. They're finite. They don't respond to supply and demand, because if you make greater demands on them, the supply does not increase, because it's what an economist calls inelastic. You just can't have more. Okay, and that applies to nearly all the mineral resources on the planet, not just oil, but many of the mineral resources we depend upon. This is going to be probably one of the real choke points for future world economies. If you want to make an investment right now, go out and start investing in these commodities, because they're definitely going up in the long run. Okay? And what economic geologists, and I've been trained in this area as well, have long known is that most resources have what's called a sort of a classic bell-shaped curve in their history. They start out by being fairly scarce, fairly lightly mined in what's called the lag phase, when people just begin to exploit it. Then they become popular, and there's an explosive growth of their exploitation until it reaches a peak. And then no matter how much more popular and how much the price goes up, their production goes down because there is almost nothing left, at least not at any price that's reasonable. That is the history of, in this case, coal in the state of Pennsylvania, silver worldwide as well as in other states. And then, of course, the one that really gets your attention is, what about oil? This famous geologist here, M. King Hubbert, one of the great prophets of all time, worked in the oil industry at Shell, he worked at the U.S. Geological Survey, he worked in academia. Back in 1956, when he was working in the oil companies, he was also a very, very astute mathematician, a good modeler. He said, okay, he knows past history of other resources. What is oil going to do? This was his prediction from a talk he gave the American Association of Petroleum Geologists back in 1956. Okay, we're almost 70 years since that talk was given. Back in 56, he predicted U.S. oil would peak right in the early 70s, right around between 71 and 75, depending upon which version of the resources you would expect. And of course, he died long before he could see the prediction come true, but it did come true. It happened in 1971. The U.S. is now way down here. Okay, there it is right there, way down here on what's called Hubbert's curve of peak oil. We are now way past the peak of our production. Okay? And you say, well, what about all this new production that's going on in North Dakota and Montana with all this shale oil and fracking and so on going on? Just to give you a sense of perspective, there is that peak of U.S. oil in 1971. Okay? Alaska gave us a little more legs, but still, look how much it declined. This is all we're getting right now. That green area there. That's all that is. It doesn't even begin to match what we used to produce. Okay? What about world? Okay, that's a little trickier, knowing what our world orbit looks like. But most people have predicted it would happen somewhere in the window around 2012 to 2013, so it already happened. Cheap oil will be gone in the lifetime of most of the people in this room, around 2050. Okay? And the effects of the shortage will start happening. So here's the curve as it's starting to occur on the worldwide basis. Here's the actual data. There's the peak, early in 2013. Okay? Well, you say, what about the oil glut? Now, right now, the oil price is cheap in many parts of the world. Not here in California, but it's cheap in many parts of the world. If you talk to any commodity trader who knows oil, or any geologist, it's all a short-term market fluctuation. What's happened is the Saudis are flooding the market at the same time the Chinese have cut back on demand a bit because they have a slight downturn in their economy. The Saudis have the cheapest to produce oil in the world at $5 a barrel. So they can afford to flood the market, just like John D. Rockefeller used to do back a century ago. Okay? What they're doing is squeezing the Iranians, the Russians, everybody else that competes with them to wipe out their oil industries while they can, okay? Because they have to drill oil at $50 to $150 a barrel, okay? When enough American oil companies have gone under, the smaller ones mostly, that'll let the price rise again. And then you'll see the kinds of prices we are used to seeing, okay? Why do we know this is the case? Because you can predict exactly when this is going to happen just by knowing the history of discovery. Here's the history of discovery in green of the US. Okay, peaked in the 1930s, pretty much gone by the 70s. And there's a 35-year lag between discovery and production. Very, very predictable. We know it very, very well. Okay? Here it is on the worldwide basis. The peak in the worldwide basis, 60s to 70s. It's been declining ever since then. No supergiant fields have been found that anywhere match what we used to have. And this doesn't show what's happening now, but our production curve was going down now too. So this is the kind of price. I took this last week in my own neighborhood. You can expect very soon US-wide, and this will never go back because the Saudis, of course, will play games with us, but eventually the Chinese and Indians will want that oil. And we'll see gas lines like I remember from the 70s, and some of you probably remember from the 70s. This is going to be the norm in the future, okay? The oil age was a strange little blip in US history, okay? It lasted from early in the 20th century, and it's probably going to be gone by the year 2100 or a little after, okay? And that's how it looks on the perspective here. Right? Because we consume 77 billion barrels of oil a day on this planet. And there's only about 3,000 billion to be consumed, most of which is already gone. Okay? And we see this all over the place. If you read the right sources, you'll know what's happening. We're at the end of the oil age already. Cheap oil doesn't exist anymore, except in Saudi Arabia. All the oil we produce offshore and in North Dakota is expensive to produce. Okay? And so things like giant SUVs, like driving a Hummer down the street, that was a silly luxury we should never have had. Okay? The oil age is so far gone that even oil companies, they're not stupid. They can see this. Okay? They're starting to advertise, like British Petroleum, which nowadays stands for biggest polluter, are advertising themselves as going on a low-carbon diet. This is a carbon company saying this. Okay? Others, like Shell and Chevron, have had similar ad campaigns. They're going to prepare us for the fact that someday they're going to move out of oil completely. Okay? We say, oh, well, I don't need oil that much. Power plants, home heating oil in the East are dependent on it. Every plastic and synthetic you name comes from cheap oil. So much for the clothes half the people in this room are wearing, okay? So much for the cheap plastic McDonald's Happy Meal toys they're so used to, okay? Chemical fertilizers and pesticides. We use 80 gallons of oil to make an acre of corn. Pesticides, fertilizers, fuel for the tractor, okay? And this is the way our entire economy is based now, and all of our agriculture is based, and yet we're feeding 7.4 billion people and increasing with a very vulnerable thing that's dependent on cheap oil. Now, not just oil, but real limits of many other kinds of resources, okay? Some of which are completely exhausted here in the US, and they're always dependent on global politics. So we are dependent on other parts of the world for many things, like strontium, manganese, cobalt, tantalum, chromium, and so on. These are all things we have to buy somewhere else. Aluminum, 100%. Imported. Every time you throw an aluminum can away, the earth cries. And of course, global geopolitics don't always favor us, all right? We've gone now to 2 wars in the Persian Gulf, millions and trillions of dollars, and thousands of American lives over oil, okay? As you might wonder, why does South Africa have an apartheid regime so long? They had the world economy in the palm of their hand. They have the biggest supply of industrial diamonds for oil bits, drilling, platinum, vanadium. They hold those crucial elements. Most of the rest are in the countries of the former Soviet Union. Don't count on getting them when you want, okay? Here's something no one talks about. China now has almost a world monopoly on rare earth elements that are essential for all electronics. We used to have some of them up in the mountain pass area up there by on the road to Vegas, but we're just about mined out. This is where it all comes from, China. They've held Japan hostage a couple of times over electronics parts. Okay, these are the hard realities we have to think about. 70% of the world's resources are being used by us, the developed countries, the 30%. And now those developed nations, which only consume 30%, now want their share, like China and India. Commodities are only going to go up in price and down in quantity. Okay, I'll skip for time reasons. I'll skip the planetary boundaries thing here, but we have lots of ways in which this is showing up. Okay, so thoroughly depressed you by now, I hope. Okay, but this is important, right? You don't hear people tell you hard realities as often as you should hear them. Thinking is very upsetting. It tells you things you'd rather not know, but you're better off knowing them than not knowing them, aren't you? Okay, and scientists aren't killjoys or sports by nature. We don't like to make you sad, but we have to tell you the truth. We have to be honest with our data, okay? And this affects, I hope all of our speakers today will think about this when they talk about the future, because the future, business as usual, is not going to be as usual in the next century. Now, before we go away, totally depressed, let me say a few things about hopeful things. There are lots of signs that many of the rest of the world's nations are taking this seriously. They've gone seriously into various types of renewable energies and getting away from oil and coal. France has invested heavily in this, and they do this, of course, by taxing oil at its true externalized costs so that it goes into infrastructure. Germany, when the Green Party got influential, they went heavily into renewables and alternative energy. Okay, so even north of the border in Canada, they can do renewables. Okay, Germany now produces 74% energy from renewables. These countries have all gotten on the bandwagon here. There's lots of signs that if we had the will, there is a way. Okay, even the biggest consumers other than us, India and China, are trying really hard and making agreements. And China, just in the last 4 months, had an astonishing reduction in their coal production, okay, carbon emissions. So this is what we need to do all these various things: energy independence, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities. And then somebody who doesn't like climate says, oh, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Even if climate change weren't happening, we should be doing these things, okay? So here's our choices, okay? We can keep reproducing like a bacterium that shoots out of control, okay, or like a cancer is a better analogy. Or we're going to have to slow this down, because otherwise human population will do something like this. And we'll be just a little blip in history, okay? And this is something I take very seriously, okay? We don't own this planet. We don't get to keep everything we have in this life. We don't inherit the planet from ancestors. We borrow it from our children. Think about that. Here's my children. I'm hoping they have a better planet to live with and don't curse the day that my generation and my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation screwed it all up. We've got to keep this planet up for Keith Richards, who seems to want to live forever. So this is our little space capsule, our little pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan called it. We've got to take care of our lifeboat. There aren't any others out there. Thank you.